let's try and get started. First thing probably is, why do we need to talk about this topic, and why is it that we need to talk about this now? German politics, I take it, don't regularly make it into the news in the US. I've checked, because this is a really hot topic presently in Germany, I checked the news and media in the US and actually found something on that, so I was really glad. Look at that. That's from the New York Times, March 15. It's an article titled "Germans First, the Food Bank Bars Migrants Setting Off a Storm." Actually, we're going to talk about the storm mainly today. What you can't see, but could see if you were to approach really closely, there's a list of related coverage, as they call it, stuff on Germany, basically. And you can tell that it's about every 3 weeks that Germany makes it into the New York Times. And typically it's topics that are more closely related to like big politics, foreign policy, etc. So it's quite remarkable that poverty really made its way into this article. Now, what was this story about? It's about a food bank in the medium-sized town, Western Germany, of Essen. And the head of this food bank, basically run by a large NGO with many regionalized branches, decided at some point not to admit migrants anymore to the distribution of food at this food bank. The reason why the person did that is that they felt that there was too much of a conflict about, well, the food that was offered, plus all the kinds of probably stereotype-laden notions of behavioral concerns about foreigners that might come up there. So they'd say, well, you know, it's young Arabic males who do not pay respect to women, and they are much more assertive in terms of trying to get in the front of the row, etc., etc. Actually, no one really talked about that. Being a lawyer, I think I should add, I guess it's illegal. We have this anti-discrimination law similar to your Civil Rights Act. It's not entirely clear whether food banks as a charitable distribution of goods would really come under that, but there's at least a case to be made that they do. And definitely there's this principle of anti-discrimination, and not in legal terms, but at least in moral terms, this triggered a major outcry in the first place. Most politicians, all parties, tried to quickly side with the opponents and say, well, you know, can't do that. But the interesting part, and that's basically what leads us to the current, to my present talk now, the interesting thing is that it didn't take more than maybe 2 days for the whole debate to turn, and they said, you know, doesn't really matter, don't blame it on the person who took this decision. The major scandal is that in Germany we have to think about apportionment of food in food banks, and people would go further than that. Maybe to fill you in a bit on this, Germans, I think, at least in the international perspectives, or if they interact in an international sphere, they would consider themselves as something like the motherland of welfare. And there's, historically, we have this Bismarckian reforms, and much of that is still visible in many welfare states nowadays. And it's still part of the self-portrayal and maybe the self-image of Germans. So politicians of all parties quickly would try to well, jump onto this self-portrayal and say, well, you know, there's no way that poverty can be such a problem in Germany. And hence, the storm that was set off developed into a sizable and still ongoing debate about poverty in Germany. As a student of Poverty Matters, for myself, this was rather amazing, because we have had this poverty problem for a long time. I regularly teach a course on well, the law of poverty, more or less, and if you follow political debates, the government-driven reporting on poverty, etc., you do not see a heightened degree of awareness of this problem, or of public awareness, let's call it that way. People, of course, know, but they don't really put it to the fore. Now it has come to the fore. One of the most recent developments, a few weeks after that incident, Germany finally formed a government. The new minister who's in charge of that, one of the rather conservatives among the conservatives, so right-wing conservative, would come up and say, well, you know, there is no such thing as poverty in Germany. The program designed for that, it's labeled Hartz IV, we're going to get to that, is not poverty, but our response to poverty. And this triggered yet another outcry. There was an online petition within 24 hours, about 100,000 people signed and invited the minister to live on Hartz IV for a while, to just prove whether he really would remain consistent with this statement. So a major debate about poverty in Germany at present. And that's basically what I thought we might talk about. The starting point, hence, is the assumption that poverty has become more of a problem in Germany than it used to be. I've put assumption here because this is not going to be an empirical talk. I'm not going to go into all the, I mean, it's a really complicated, complex issue. In order to claim that things have changed for the worse, you would have to fix indicators, you would have to establish certain groups, and of course, it's a vast problem, millions of people affected, and obviously this could take up the entire course. However, at least let's take it from where the public debate seems to stand right now. Everybody perceives poverty as a problem right now, and most of them in a surprised fashion, interestingly. Okay, so this is our starting point. The plan is to take this diagnosis and review the last 25 years of poverty policies in Germany and try to understand what brought us here. By explaining this plan and also taking so much time to explain the actual trigger for this talk, there's of course kind of a disclaimer or apologetic element to that. I'm not presenting this thing to you. I haven't chosen this question because I had any answers to that, rather because the question is salient right now, and hence the talk will be much about a kind of collective quest for answers. Well, speaking of that, you're most welcome to interrupt me whenever you like. I mean, I think there's discussion time in the end, but I'm fine whenever you like, whenever there are questions. We can, of course, talk about that. My story in a nutshell will be one of systemic differentiation, or arguably also fragmentation. And this development has been brought about by a long sequence of reforms. Actually, the 25-year period is exactly the decisive period in the development of German poverty politics, I would argue. And all the debates, all the reforms had been considered very thoroughly. Some of them have been debated fiercely. Some would say this has been the fiercest debate we've had in social policy in the existence of post-war Germany. So definitely no coincidental reforms. And yet the result today is viewed as unsatisfactory by many, and there are proposals right now on the table, we'll get back to that at the very end, that seem to propagate a radical reversal, so we might end up coming full circle at the very end. Thus far, the preliminaries. Let's get started. A few words on the building blocks, I'd call it, of poverty policy. Don't know, I guess your backgrounds are rather heterogeneous, so it might make sense. Please don't feel offended if I mention stuff that you already know. First of all, when talking about poverty policy, there's an important distinction to be made, and that's between, I might label, prevention versus alleviation. Poverty policies depending on your mindset and the breadth of your outlook, might actually be everything. All kind of economic policy could qualify as poverty policy. And if you specifically ask a liberal Democrat in Germany about their stance towards poverty, they say, well, it's the economy, stupid. We don't do the kind of poverty policy you do, but of course we do have poverty policy in our plan. What I'm going to focus on is not this broad meaning, this broad understanding, but the narrow meaning of policies targeted to existing poverty at the very moment, and hence termed here poverty alleviation for the ones concerned at the very moment. Now, what are the kinds of instruments in the toolkit for poverty policies? A very rough categorization. First of all, what you can do is hand out benefits, and that's basically what most governments do. They differ in whether they hand out benefits in terms of cash or whether they're in kind. And in kind would be something like the food stamp that is quite well known in the US, but it could also be services, right? So that is the basic approach. Beyond that, of course, there's a lot of regulatory policies. And you see the lines, this is blurring the lines to what the general economic policies, obviously. There's a lot of regulatory policies, but the ones that are within the narrow circle of poverty instruments, I'd say, is regulated wages plus a lot of tax regulation. To again use an American example, the Earned Income Tax Credit, some 20 years ago, a relatively innovative approach at the time, is probably paradigmatic for regulating taxes in order to address poverty. Besides, literally all modern tax systems actually at some point exempt people from taxes. So the issue is there negative tax benefits, some way of handing out benefits through a system that typically takes levies. Finally, something that needs to be considered in the broader context, specifically if we talk in an international comparative setting, is the provision of institutional services. Just as by way of example, if healthcare is free, it makes a major difference specifically for poor people, as opposed to systems where it's not or only partially covered. Same for education, same for childcare. So this is the kind of goods and services that you typically or oftentimes get not on the market or not on a free market, but might be provided for by the state, and hence the existence of such institutionalized provision might be a relevant background factor for poverty policies. Next step, let's focus a bit on the specific nature of cash grants, and that's the reason why I'd like to focus a bit more on that, is that when we in the next step try to follow the development in Germany, we'll need these kinds of distinctions. So the modalities of handing out cash benefits. One is, question is, do you design a system so as to address everybody? No major preconditions, no personal qualities required, or is it targeted? Again, trying to relate it to the US experience, there has been a long tradition of such targeting non-universal benefits, the basic subsistence realm in the US, specifically targeted to single parents. Initially AFDC, later TANF, aid for families with dependent children, etc. So the idea is, in these cases, to define specific groups which you consider particularly vulnerable, arguably also particularly deserving, and help them, and by implication help others to a lesser extent. Okay? So that's the major distinction here. Do you design targeted programs, or is it a more or less universal system? Universality is probably never perfect, but there are degrees of such targeting. Second aspect is means testing. Literally every program that is designed to address poverty is means tested. This is just meant to say, well, you don't get it if you have sufficient means to live on your own, right? The key issue here is to what extent will you rely on means testing. The extreme of a non-means tested system would be a truly universal basic income, like the people in Switzerland recently discussed, just handing it to everybody, even those who have sufficient money, taking it back some other way later on via taxes, right? And then of course the efficiency problem comes up, etc. What is more, that's the extreme case. What is more common as an issue regarding means testing is, how far do you go? And there's different sources of income that are typically distinguished. One is income, so regular wages, etc. Second, assets, whatever you own. Doesn't have to be a pension plan, could just be your car or a golden watch or whatever. And third parties, family members who might provide for you, even distant relatives, etc. Okay? And looking at it more closely, you'll immediately be able to think about ways to differentiate. Of course, there's always an issue. If you have a completely means-tested system with regard to income, people have a relatively little incentive to get back to work. Only if they earn over a certain threshold, they would get back to work. So typically, means testing with regard to income has to phase in. Second, assets. If you want someone, able-bodied, working-age person to get back to work, the first thing you do is take away the person's car, which is necessary to get from whatever suburban place to any potential job. This might be problematic. So, but where do you stop? Assets is an issue. Does it make sense to eat away first people's pension plan in order to have them, even if it's inefficient to cash them now, in order to have them run into old age poverty? Or would you rather spare these assets in the program? And finally, third parties. What do you do with all these people sharing a flat? People sharing a flat and having some emotional attachment. People living on a permanent partnership basis, etc. To what extent will you hold the immediate personal surroundings liable? To what extent will you consider the household income relevant rather than the individual income? And you can imagine, when talking to the public authorities and trying to get basic subsistence grants, there is a tendency to become a rather solitary person. So looking at households has been the trend for years, but this is just one of the examples relevant in this regard. So means testing is one of the areas in which these programs differ a lot. Next one. Are there any strings attached? The major strings that come up is cooperation in terms of telling or allowing public authorities to check the conditions of entitlement. Will you lay open all your accounts, etc., etc. And the second and probably more debated issue is work or efforts to seek work as a requirement to get support. Next one, and that's in a way kind of more marginal aspects, but should briefly mention them because they'll come up later on. Is there an entitlement to these programs, or are they more or less discretionary? If I present something like that in Germany, people would typically seem a bit estranged, because everybody thinks welfare rights are entitlements. I take it that in the US, this is at least not a similar tradition. Rendering welfare programs an entitlement is relatively unusual here. It's much more common in the continental setup. I think the major example for non-entitlement welfare programs hereabouts is housing assistance, still so. What does typically happen if it's It's a statutory program. There will be budgetary allotments to that in the beginning of the year, and they will stipulate the conditions, and it looks like a statute and just looks like an entitlement program. But if you approach public authorities in May, funds are gone and you don't get anything. That's the key difference between entitlement programs or discretionary programs. Okay? Beyond that, you might start distinguishing degrees of entrenchment. How hard an entitlement is it? And if there is a constitutional foundation for that, obviously they are even less at the disposition of day-to-day politics. Finally, major issue in terms of actual outreach of these programs. How do you, or do you at all, as government, do you try to ensure that people actually take up the benefit? There's people who, or welfare recipients, generalization obviously, but an empirically corroborated generalization, oftentimes fail for whatever reason to claim their entitlements. Okay? And there are different reasons. We're going to get to one specific example in Germany. And poverty policies over the last decades have more and more come to the conviction that facilitation of take-up and an active improvement of take-up rates is something that should be part and parcel of proper poverty policies. Because why would you do it in the first place if you don't really make an effort to reach people, if you know you don't reach them? But at the same time, of course, there's this short-term temptation for every politician not to, because you're saving money. And if they don't take it up, well, whose fault is it? Okay, if you think in these categories. Okay, thus far on the building blocks, some core distinctions, kind of parameters by which to design and fine-tune a poverty program. Now, the starting point in Germany, as I said, the plan is to go back in time, to review the last 25 years, and try and understand how we stumbled into this poverty problem. And now we're going to talk about simplified, imaginary, fictitious starting point, because of course the system never looked really easy, it was always differential, etc. But more or less, the German system is composed, and still is, used to be and still is composed of a dual approach. They have a regionally variable rental assistance, that's housing grants basically. They pay for your rent or provide for an apartment. Plus, and that's what we're going to focus on, a cash grant. Why is the juxtaposition here? The cash grant is uniform across Germany. Major issue, by the way, in all these federal states and in definitely large market areas. You can imagine makes a major difference whether you want to live on basic subsistence in Munich downtown or in somewhere in eastern Germany in a small village. So what takes account of that is this, and rent is the major factor with regard to which prices differ, but this one doesn't. Quite a common feature, by the way, in other systems as well. Now, so they have a broad categorization. What they do is they define this, this overall lump sum. And there's distinctions depending on age and the kind of household you live on and so on and so on. But it's a lump sum, and it's actually tried to be adjusted every once in a while. And our starting point used to be that we had a reasonably means tested, reasonably means moderately means tested. They did take account of all these phase in, phase out problems, etc. But they had this one size fits all means testing thing. Second, they had very few strings attached. Here my formatting went astray. Sorry for that. Here we need another bullet point. It is inflation sensitive. I deliberately avoid indexed because it's not clear inflation indexing, but it is adjusted regularly and the methods have changed and so on and so on. So this is just unusual term in order to cater for complexity. and it used to be applied mostly universal. Why mostly? There used to be a complex and inefficient interaction with the social insurance phase-out unemployment benefit, but beyond that, there was no distinction between different groups of poor people. Okay. We have relatively extensive institutional provisions in an international comparison, that is the healthcare, education, etc. stuff, and finally red herring in the German system, we're going to get to that, no statutory minimum wage. That's the starting point 25 years back. Relatively simplified. And this is a timeline, and I apologize in advance. It's going to be awful. The colors are going to be horrible. I can't even claim to be colorblind. It's just like the taste. Don't know whether that's any better or worse, but at least I've apologized. So the idea now is that I try to summarize all these complex reforms briefly on this timeline. First thing that happened. So this is the past, this is the present, and somewhere, the past used to be really constant, somewhere, and that is specifically 1993, 25 years back, the first thing happened, and that's a new statute addressing basic subsistence for asylum seekers and related groups. What was the context? It was immediately after the fall of the Iron Curtain, was the Balkan Wars. Many people coming to Germany, partly temporary refugees from the Balkans, partly people who were likely to be there for good, and huge numbers, largely neglected I think at the time and still, of people of German descent from Eastern Europe, who had a constitutional right to become resident and citizen. And in fact, these were, over I think, a period of 5 years, between 2 and 3 million, so huge numbers. Major problems, serious concerns about right-wing parties, riots at asylum seeker homes. Some of you might still remember the horrible coverage in the press. So the political reaction obviously has to be understood against this background. What did they do? And there's much symbolism here, you might. They reduced welfare benefits quite significantly for this group. The major thing what they did is not reducing it in absolute terms, but moving towards a system of in-kind benefits, not handing out cash. Two justifications. One, a word thing, try to prevent migratory incentives to arise. And the probably less outspoken thing, but quite obvious, calm down political outrage at the time. By demonstrating, look, we're not favoring them, we're not treating them. We're really reducing them to the minimum that is needed. They try to respond to this public outrage. Okay, and from then on, not much happened in welfare policy for a couple of years, more than a decade actually, till the next reform. Oh, sorry, wrong key. 2005, and that's the thing that if you know anything about German poverty policy, you will know that one. That's the so-called Hartz reform. Hartz because the guy who chaired the commission was called Peter Hartz. Quite an unusual thing for German politics at the time, to have an informal non-parliamentarian committee charged with the task of designing a reform package. Peter Hartz was a board member of Volkswagen. he's been quite popular, or used to be quite popular at the time. Later on, for different reasons, became rather unpopular. The reform certainly contributed to the loss in popularity. However, historically unjust, the hardest thing about the reform was not to be ascribed to him, as people recently brought to light. Okay, so what happened and what was the context of this reform? That is globalization, deborderized Europe, welfare state crisis debates. We have Germans having led for, I think, almost a decade debates about competitiveness in a global market, about the excessively flourishing welfare state in Germany as a major competitive disadvantage. And the dimensions here are, in Europe always, part of it is competition within this open market of the EU, part of it is of course the increasingly globalized economy. Beyond that, there is this diagnosis of huge unemployment, and a sizable fraction of which to be ascribed to long-term unemployed people. Plus many minor issues of modernization that certainly were up to be cured. The reforms used to be a major, probably the most controversial project of the government of the time. It was, we're going to get to that again, the government of Gerhard Schröder. So the Social Democrats and the Green Party would introduce that. The existence of this non-parliamentary committee certainly is to be understood against this background, because it was so controversial. There was this urge to try and involve many actors. What did the Hartz reforms do? Huge package to try and mobilize the labor market. The benefit we're talking about and the reform we're talking about is called Hartz IV, so number 4. It's a package of 4 acts that reform German labor market, the regime for the German labor market. Focusing on this specific welfare-related thing, the Hartz IV statute would introduce huge would unify the entire system with regard to unemployment insurance benefits that used to be around before, and welfare grants. So solidify, consolidate the system in a way. And beyond that, introduce a system of high requirements in terms of efforts to work, lowering the threshold for the acceptability of new jobs. Be a neurosurgeon, lose your job. Either you look for an adequate position again, a similar position, or you end up selling whatever coffee in a coffee shop. There's a long scale in between. German system used to be relatively generous before, and it tried to tighten the rules with regard to this. Plus also Germans, as you might know, by way of stereotype, tend not to be really mobile in regional terms, at least as compared to the US. This was another one. So lose your job in Munich and find one in Berlin. Is this something that you're required to do? That's the key change that happened. The idea was to try and enable people to find social inclusion by way of work, to activate them. And I guess I don't have, at least not in this forum, fill you in on all the rhetoric that was around in this workfare ideology of the 90s. Basically, this is something that, and the US reforms, the Clinton reforms, played a major role in the political debate in Germany on that one. So the idea was activating labor market policy, welfare should force people to work, but give something in return and get them, well, try to be more active in finding a job for them, etc. Now, again, to this, with regard to the symbolism, this really sophisticated symbolism of this scheme. This is a long one because people use the standard has been lowered, I argue, more significantly, but it's relatively narrow because it's few people. Obviously, this is a simplification because whether it's many or not depends on the time. This is broad because it's really many, not really depending on the time, but it's shorter because the incisive, though, the stuff that reforms were, they were not quite as hard as those. Okay. Next one. Sorry, I always hit the wrong key. At the same time, however, in an entirely unrelated debate, quite interesting. Not part of the Hartz debates, hardly even noticed. There was another reform, and that was trying to alleviate the conditions, to mitigate the conditions for welfare recipients who are beyond pension age, and for systematic reasons also people who are slightly incapacitated, to use this kind of old-fashioned and politically incorrect word, going back or relating to the German systematic background on that. So people who can work, who do not necessarily come under a disability definition, but who cannot be in full employment for these reasons. These people, yeah.
What's the German word for partially incapacitated?
Nicht voll erwerbsfähig.
Yeah. So nicht schwer behindert.
Nein, gar nicht. It's not disability.
Okay.
It's along the lines of limited capacity to work.
Okay.
And hence, well, the incapacitated thing is it comes from this incapacitation, workman's compensation background. Okay, the idea behind this reform was, first, that people targeted and identified a major problem, and that was old age recipients of welfare, pension age recipients, would not go and collect their benefits. And why is that? Because we had a system in which when you go and collect your benefits, public authorities will hand them out to you in Germany, and they will get a refund from your children. Because, interestingly, we have a system of a duty of maintenance within the family, not just the direction downward, parents towards their children, but also upward. And this was highly problematic because parents never wanted, or most of them, many of them, never wanted their children to provide for them, at least not beyond the informal kind of provision that they anyway got. So oftentimes they wouldn't take it up. Second, just being ashamed of having to go to this public agency and collect this stuff. So the idea was try and address the low take-up rate. Completely different direction, completely different context, however, exactly at the same time. What did they do? They, the major reform was to increase the threshold for holding the children liable. You have to be really, really high income children if you have to pay for that nowadays. They raised it like, what's the level of basically high earning professionals. And before that there was hardly any restriction, it was just the general rules. Okay? So this was the major reform here, and a couple of other attempts to increase take-up rate. Have public authorities, specifically the pension authorities, tell you about your entitlement. Relatively small error and not too wide. It's sizable numbers, not quite as big as that one. No major change, but an important one definitely for that group. Benevolent, upward. Right?
Why was it done in 2005?
Why exactly then? Really hard question. I mean, in a way, obviously I can only speculate. I'm astonished myself by the coincidence, and in fact, even looking back, having followed this, I thought it was detached or had been detached also in time, but I double-checked, and it's almost exactly the same. They must have been in Parliament overlappingly.
Did it have to do with the altar styles, right, topic?
No, I don't think so. At least I don't see a clear relation with that. I do see an increasing awareness over the time here regarding policies addressed to the elderly, definitely. But I don't really know. But the best I could come up with is tell you there is kind of a dynamic of its own in German social administration. They, in a way, below the surface, keep reforming the system and consolidating the system, and they have kept doing that for decades. Absolutely anachronistically, Germany, no one does codifications anymore. The big age of statutory codifications is a century back. And the Germans have started in the 70s to build the social code, Sozialgesetzbuch. In the 70s, we're talking about book number 13 now. The whole thing is that size. The civil code is just ridiculously little compared to that. And they continue building this thing. And that happens regardless. Of course, it's affected, and the contents are affected, etc. And sometimes a new book comes up because of political vicissitudes of day-to-day life. But by and large, on the long run, you get this long-term project of codification, and there must be some people in their caves working towards a rationalized legal code in the social sphere. Right? And I would rather ascribe it, satirically, to this kind of development, whereas this was definitely outcome of the political climate of the day. After that, you had a question?
Any correlation with Zuwanderungsgesetz, which was also 2005? I mean, the new citizenship law was 2000, and then 2005 there was the immigration law.
Hard one. I mean, I wouldn't see any specific. Zuwanderungsgesetz at the time was living up to a promise on part of the leftist government, and it did at almost no cost economically. It was a major symbolic issue, finally, to modernize our notion of citizenship, of being part of the community or not. So a major thing, but there was no Zuwanderung at the time, and so or little relatively. So I don't really see that. I mean, of course, there's if it's at the same time, it's always related. Might well be that this was part of the comfort to the leftist clientele of the government, which helped them swallow that one. Connections of that kind, but I don't see, at least in the back of my mind, any connection otherwise. Okay, beyond that, I mean, there has been major debates about that. There have been struggles in terms of trying to revert that, and major conflicts within the left. But and the Chancellor Schröder lost the election right after that. Barely though, was close, right? Anyway, but no major steps happened until quite a long time after that, and that's here, very recently, mostly neglected. We had a huge reform of disability law. Has been fiercely debated, if only within a specific sphere. It was not just kind of this general social issue, but all the groups interested would be involved, and there was a major debate around that. It's not perceived typically as a welfare reform, but it's, I think, a really interesting component of it. It's really interesting in terms of welfare policy. What is it? For the first time, they created a kind of hybrid between social insurance and tax-financed benefits. The general paradigm out there is insurance benefits, social security in American terms, right, is something that you, well, earn by paying contributions, and hence this is not means testing. You pay and you get back, no matter whether you need it. That's much more the case in Germany than here. Note that the American statutory pension system is highly redistributive. It's not in Germany, by far not so much. And hence, it's much more plausible to take up this, or to maintain this distinction between the two. Okay? And there is recognition, you even see it in terms. You, in America, talk about social security taxes. This would be a no-go systematically in Germany. It's contributions here and taxes there. Taxes aren't earmarked. They can go anywhere. Contributions are. You pay and you get back. It's not in original accounts, etc., but there's much more protection there. And one of the implications of that is no means testing. Typically, that's exceptions, but mainly no means testing. Now, and on the other hand, of course, everything that's tax financed is only handed out if you need it, and to the extent that you need it. The welfare element of the disability reform introduced a new concept. What they basically did is that they redefined the assets and the income that are being spared. What's the issue behind that? People on disability benefits oftentimes cannot earn money and aren't rich anyway, aren't wealthy. But some of them can be included just normally in the labor force, and under the prior system, everything that they needed in support would first be counted towards their earnings. So, be a software engineer with a very expensive disability. You need personal assistance, say 12 hours a day. You can't earn so much so as to lift yourself beyond poverty this way. You'll always be condemned to live on this poverty threshold just because your additional needs are so high. And it's a welfare system, so all your incomes will be calculated, counted towards your, counted against your benefits. Second major issue, you can never marry, because if you are part of this kind of official household community, your spouse's income will also be taken into the calculation. Which meant that a specific group of people with a disability could never grow out of poverty. Those who have expensive needs, but the capacity to earn, or some assets. Yeah.
Would you consider the rent control law, Mietpreisbremse from 2015, as a maybe failed intent to also contribute to this, or doesn't it have to do anything with that?
Oh, definitely, yeah. If you don't mind, I'll get back there. Please remind me in a few minutes. But definitely, it's one of the kind of the regulatory environment things that we need to talk about. So the disability thing, very brief. I'll get back there in a second. The disability thing introduced this new scheme, and what they basically did is they defined a medium kind of wealth, medium income, medium assets, and only beyond that, your income and wealth will be counted towards your benefits. Major step up, but for a very small number of people. So that's for now all the major reforms in the last 25 years. Couple of refinements before we go on. Time-wise, we're running into problem.
About 10 minutes?
Yeah, that's fine. Should be done then. Okay, I should mention that this reform, the abbreviation of TFCC is German Federal Constitutional Court. So there have been many battles around that. The German Federal Constitutional Court corrected this one in 2010 with regard to certain kinds of calculating the benefit. No overly lump sum definition of needs. And it did the same with regard to asylum seekers in 2012. So in a way lifted them up a bit and corrected the excessive urge in part of the legislature to cut back. Another one, and here we're very close to what you mentioned, we're going to get to that in a second. They introduced the statutory minimum wage in 2014. Really a red herring. At that time, everybody in the OECD world had one, more or less, except Germans, and then they introduced that. Relatively decent level, it's somewhere around, say, $11, $12 now. Very fiercely debated, we're going to get to that in a second, and definitely, haven't included that here, but they also attempted to regulate rent controls. They wanted to cap the rise of rent for private housing, as you already implied, an attempt that so far seems to have failed because they simply didn't manage to implement the law effectively. But they're going to work on it again, so we're going to see whether the device, if implemented, might be effective or counterproductive. We'll see. Okay, thus far, that's the overall picture. Now, what I wanted to do briefly with you is try and address a couple of puzzles, easier ones and harder ones, before we end, and 10 minutes should be okay for that. First question. One didn't really know in Germany, we have this constitution, this dignity-oriented constitution, this very social, rights-oriented court in an international comparison. But it wasn't really clear whether the constitution was considered to contain a right to a basic minimum protection. People thought that this was the case, but there had never been a judgment. The two judgments that I mentioned actually pronounced the right quite strongly. They wouldn't fix an absolute amount, but they'd impose strict requirements with regard to how you define and how consistently you define what the calculations are in order to have this minimum. They said there is a minimum, we can't say the number, but we can tell you have to be really thorough in calculating it, and if you make any mistakes, it doesn't work. Interestingly, however, now that the court has done that, now that we finally know that our constitution seems to enshrine such a right, there's ample cases in which we discussed whether it's being observed. The most recent one is sanctions. A system that wants to impose work requirements definitely needs to impose some kind of sanction, otherwise you can forget about the work requirements. Problem is that they're really draconic, and problem is that many of the addressees of such requirements simply don't observe them. So it's not just a threat, you have to implement them. And courts, regional courts in Germany, regularly run into these problems, and there's just a question of months now that the Constitutional Court will have to at least take up the issue. Not sure when they're going to decide about that. Okay, next one. Absolutely red herring. Germany for decades didn't have a minimum wage. Why is that? This the self-perceived motherland of welfarism. No minimum wage. And the explanation is basically the Social Democrats didn't like it. And when it was introduced, it was a concession of the Social Democrats, and they had a really hard time to do that. Why is that? We used to have strong unions, and the unions thought it's their job to ensure that. Plus, we never needed that because we had relatively generous basic subsistence grants. The minimum wage wouldn't really lift you much further than that. Okay. So we got away with, we abolished these generous basic subsistence grants, and unions are, the degree of unionization is going back steadily. So basically it was the time now, plus the strict work requirements with moderately generous, still at least existing basic subsistence grants, led to a situation in which people had to work after that for wages of like 2 or 3 euro an hour, and the rest would be paid by the state, because they cannot really have them fall below a really hard threshold. And obviously this wasn't anything that government could tolerate for a long time. And in fact, the Hartz Commission at the time even said, well, it doesn't make any sense to introduce that without a minimum wage. Just took another 10 years for this to be politically viable. But it definitely had to come. Otherwise, you subsidize low-wage employers who can really ask you to work for very low wages just because the state is going to supplement it. Next one, another oddity. Why is that? Looking back 35 years, there were only 7 years of a truly leftist government, the Red-Green coalition. All the rest was conservatively led governments. And it's just in this period that arguably the harshest curtailment of welfare occurred in German politics. It's probably many people, definitely not my judgment, many people would argue this is the most incisive moment in German social policy after World War II, and it's a leftist government, and we had really few of them. Interesting, right? I wouldn't know, as I said, I have no explanations for that. Might be spirit of the time. You know, the median voter strategy, Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, Gerhard Schröder, might have been a wise thing. Those on the left side are going to vote for me anyway, so I'll try and get the others. Maybe a perceived sense of necessity. Who knows? But at least it's a red herring. It certainly ties into the next and last question that we need to address. So how come? I mean, if you look at the overall picture, all the other aspects now used to focus on just individual aspects. But in order to explain and lack of sophistication here, the whole thing should be tilted that way, right? Definitely went downward. Everybody thinks nowadays, at least that's our assumption, we have a poverty problem, whereas people would have been much more likely to buy into the claim it's our hard spheres the answer to poverty, it's not poverty. Now people disagree. So why is that? And in order to explain that, it's not just the logics of individual reforms. I guess it's also, what you also would need to explain is why wasn't there any other movement, any counter movement? So all the stuff that hasn't happened needs to be taken into account as well. So why would this occur? And we have lower unemployment, we have an economy which is in a definitely better position than in the early 90s. Why is that? We have overall growing wealth. Why is that? One thing is, I think one of the kind of unifying trends might be globalization, and there's two elements in there. It's migratory dimension of globalization, and it's the perceived competitiveness of different regimes. I'm not sure to what extent this is a real threat, but it's certainly, like the welfare magnets debate in the US, has been present. You don't really know whether anyone actually moves on, is mobile enough to propel the system. However, in anticipation of potential competition, deborderized systems tend to feel under pressure. Another very important one, at least to my mind, is policy diffusion. The Hartz reform was mainly informed by the idea it's an ethical argument about you should work, and a prognosis about the effects of social policy. If you only activate people, they will be happier, they will be socially included, they will come back. So they are susceptible to activation in a way. That's the underlying factual belief. And that's something that was really prevalent in the 90s internationally. Workfare, from welfare to work, all these slogans, that's something that certainly also caught the political debate in Germany. And it's interesting in Germany because we used to have this idea of universalized system of a dignity-based rationale. You hand out benefits because that's what human dignity requires, whatever human dignity might mean. That was the idea. It was unconditional, universal, for everybody. The moment you start talking about want to activate people, we need to attach strings, we need to make it conditional on something, of course you change the entire logics. I think policy diffusion played a role in that. Stratification might well be that we have this, we witness a steady widening of the income and wealth scale in Germany, as we do in the US, not quite as fast a development, but also present in Germany. And the more unlikely you get as the decisive part of the electorate not to ever fall into poverty, the less you might care about these groups of people. So social stratification and increasing wealth inequality might just change the political setup and help such policies, neglect of poverty, of the lower quintile of the population, render more viable. And finally, and I think that's that could be at least the most dangerous one to my mind, the dynamics of regulatory differentiation. No one might have thought about that. It makes perfect sense if you think about, well, you know, asylum seekers, we need to also think about incentives, and here, why don't we distinguish between those who work because we can activate them and we need to have a different regime. And yes, the pension age people, specific problem, have a different system for them. Disabled persons, obviously, why would you have a harsh regime that for whatever reason you need to have here? Why would you have it in this realm? So distinction on its face makes sense. However, the moment you introduce the distinction between different kinds of deservingness, you might trigger a logic, a dynamic that we're witnessing right now. In fact, when I started dealing with poverty issues, first thing I looked at basically was the US system in my doctoral thesis. What struck me most was that there was this term of the deserving poor, which didn't exist in German debates. Today, everybody would fully relate to that. And that might be the result of exactly this kind of incremental sequence of reform steps, each of which might make sense, but which, taken together, shift the paradigm from here to there. Last one, an irony, and then we're really done. Everybody's talking about universal basic income nowadays. 3 out of 6 major parties in German parliament have made it part of their program. The Liberal Democrats, a weird version of it, the leftists, and very recently in response to this food bank scandal, the Social Democrats, part of our government. They come up with an idea which everybody who knows the system would say, well, yeah, we had that 25 years back, more or less. Talking about universal basic income makes a lot of sense. If you talk about algorithms taking over, you don't need so many people working. Oh, that's a clear sign though. So it makes a lot of sense, but it's absolutely opposed to the trend that we've seen. But ironically, we might get it because it might well be the last chance of salvation for the Social Democrats, because everybody says if they don't get off the label of being the introducers of Hartz IV, they might vanish. So, thus far, thank you very much.
Thank you.